This is the Motorola Dynatac, the brick phone of the 1980s, 1G. With 2G in the 90s, mobile communication becomes digital, so SMS becomes possible. With 3G, phones perform basic internet and email functions. With 4G, they become platforms for app economies. Up to this point, each generation connects people through devices. With 5G, however, the significance is no longer mainly the phone. The focus shifts from the device to the environment. 5G makes connected environments possible by enabling machine-to-machine communication. Think in the context of the smart city, where 5G is the nervous system, allowing smart devices like sensors and traffic lights to coordinate in real time. AI then becomes the cognitive layer, the intelligence behind the system's eyes and ears. Machines, in turn, become the body of the system, the muscle on the ground. Sensors see, AI interprets, and devices respond. That's why surveillance isn't an add-on to the system. It's embedded in it. The smart city must sense before it can act or govern. This is where Foucault's panopticon becomes relevant. The point isn't simply that people are watched, but that the built environment itself can be organized around monitoring and correction. But surveillance alone isn't enough to create a totalized permission regime. For that, the system must also know who each person is, how that person receives livelihood, and whether that person's finances can be controlled. That's where digital ID, UBI, and CBDC become decisive. Digital ID makes people legible to machines. It may work through a device, an account, an actual face in front of a camera, or some other data point. And UBI is a policy response to automation. If machines replace human labor, the argument goes, the state provides income directly. However, historically, labor has given people leverage because employers and the state needed them as workers and taxpayers. If livelihood becomes a grant from the state, that leverage weakens. And CBDC, unlike ordinary money, can be programmed or frozen. Money then becomes less of a medium of exchange than an account inside a centralized system. Each of these layers changes the political outcome. The escalation is stepwise. Smart infrastructure coordinates urban life. Digital ID links access to identity. UBI turns livelihood into a system-mediated grant. And CBDC makes money revocable. If these layers are integrated, access to ordinary life suddenly becomes conditional across multiple key domains. This may sound dystopian, and that's partly because our cultural image of technology has changed in the 21st century. In the mid-1900s, popular culture imagined automation as a set of push-button conveniences. In the Jetsons, for example, machines served humans from the background and made everyday life easier. But in the 2020s, the language of automation often carries a darker meaning. It suggests monitoring and control. So the Jetsons gives way to Black Mirror. That cultural shift matters because it reflects a broader political intuition. Automation is no longer imagined only as convenience, but as a possible architecture of control. A totalized permission regime doesn't exist yet, but some of its components are already mature and others are advancing quickly. The danger lies not in any single technology in isolation, but in what becomes possible when these systems converge. The political question then is what kind of power becomes possible when they integrate. 4 literatures help explain the seriousness of this shift. The first literature explains how technology itself can govern. A long line of thinkers warned about this long before these technologies were even imagined. Their central point is that technologies don't merely serve human purposes. They also shape how societies perceive the world and decide what counts as normal and efficient. The clock didn't just tell time. It reorganized life through standardized time. A search engine doesn't just retrieve information, it ranks reality. A digital platform doesn't just host speech, it shapes attention and visibility. In the digital age, citizens increasingly live inside technical systems that structure perception and permission. Rights may remain on paper, but practical freedom increasingly depends on the technical environments through which people navigate social life. The second literature explains how bureaucracies make people legible to institutions. Bureaucracies cannot simply administer society from the outside. Before they can govern people, they must first translate them into files, forms, and categories. These bureaucratic instruments don't just describe people, they render them comparable and governable. Take a benefits office. The question isn't simply whether someone needs help. It's whether that someone fits the category, has the right documents, appears correctly in the database, and passes the required checks. The same logic appears across bureaucratic life: immigration, taxation, licensing, university admissions, insurance. In each case, the person reaches the system as a record. Digital systems don't replace all this bureaucracy, they automate it. The file in the cabinet becomes the profile in the database. The clerk behind the counter becomes the automated decision system. Citizens become profiles to be processed rather than persons to be heard. The third literature explains how rights can disappear in practice while remaining formally intact, a condition often described as civil death. In a digital setting, this can create a Kafkaesque situation. The citizen still has legal rights, but the administrative and technical pathways through which those rights must be exercised become blocked, opaque, or impossible to navigate. The fourth literature explains why infrastructure matters and how it quietly organizes social life by shaping where people can go, what they can access, and which systems they must pass through. For example, a digital platform doesn't just enable communication, it becomes the infrastructure through which social life, work, and access to services are mediated. Likewise, a payment network doesn't just process transactions, it makes everyday economic participation depend on systems that most people cannot influence or avoid. As these systems become more digital and identity-linked, infrastructure no longer merely supports participation, it increasingly sets the conditions for it. Life in the 2020s depends on recognition by these systems. This isn't only theoretical. Recent cases point to a pattern. Journalists, authors, judges, legal scholars, activists, and elected officials are being cut off through travel bans, frozen bank accounts, or other service denials. These individuals weren't convicted of crimes. They weren't even charged. They were excluded through administrative, extrajudicial mechanisms rather than ordinary legal process. So the argument isn't that technology destroys democracy. The argument is rather that when movement, money, work, communication, and services all pass through integrated digital infrastructures, rights can become permissions. They may remain formally protected, but become difficult to exercise. I close with 3 implications, each further developed in the paper's appendices. I've kept them outside the main presentation because each could become a separate discussion, but they're too important to leave unmentioned. The first implication concerns who actually controls the infrastructure. The relationship between states and major tech firms is becoming symbiotic. States depend on private tech systems to govern at scale, while tech firms need states for contracts, favorable regulation, legitimacy, and protection. Citizens, in turn, increasingly depend on the same systems to live. The danger is that governmental power and private infrastructure are fusing into a shared system of control, while responsibility becomes harder to locate. The second implication concerns how we measure democracy in the digital age. In the 2020s, a country may still have elections, courts, political parties, newspapers, and civil rights, but if law-abiding citizens cannot travel, work, pay, speak, or access services without passing through conditional digital systems, then democracy has weakened in a way our usual measures may be blind to. The final implication concerns what happens if AI stops being merely a tool. In the formula, AI is the cognitive layer of the system. But with superintelligence, that role changes. At that point, the risk shifts from automated permission to autonomous permission, implying that the entire system could move toward machine sovereignty, perhaps without humans even realizing it until they're effectively locked out of control. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.